This is evolution video number 4. It's all about evidence of evolution, evidence that evolution occurs, and also evidence that organisms might be related to one another. So the oldest method of figuring out who was related to whom was using fossil evidence. So fossils are remains of ancient life, and sometimes they form in different layers of rock. Sometimes they're imprints, sometimes they're bones that have been replaced by minerals. But you have to have hard parts to become mineralized or fossilized. You don't see a lot of fossil jellyfish. So the hard parts like bones and shells typically become fossilized. You can end up with imprints. I don't know if you can see this very well, but there is a footprint that was in the mud that has fossilized. And this is easier to see. There are imprints of leaves. This looks sort of like ferns. And you can have organisms getting trapped in amber. Amber is fossilized tree sap. You also can get organisms preserved in ice. But if you go in a particular area, the older fossils are found deeper. So the further down you go in a particular location, the older that the fossils become. Now, of course, you cannot compare a particular depth in one area with a depth in another area because of plate tectonics and Earth's crust is shifting. And there may be different geological activity in those areas. So you can only dig in a particular area vertically to figure out where the more recent organisms are versus the oldest. So another piece of evidence of evolution is using comparative anatomy, looking at similarities and differences in body structure. Homologous structures are body parts that are similar in structure and embryonic development, but have a different use. And it's evidence of common ancestry and divergent evolution. For example, all vertebrates have very similar structure in their forelimbs. For example, the wing of a bat is used for flight and the flipper of a whale is used for swimming, so there's different function, but if you look at the underlying bone structure, it's very similar. So if you look at this X-ray, two X-rays side by side, can you tell what they are? The one on the left is a dog, and the one on the right is a hand of a human. So this is a dog's paw and a human hand, and the bone structure is very, very similar, suggesting that we are related. So this shows the structure of the forelimbs of 6 vertebrates: a box turtle, a dolphin, a human, a horse, a fruit bat, and a chicken. Now, you might start to think, because they have wings, that chickens and fruit bats are closely related, but fruit bats would be more closely related to the human than the chicken. But if you look at the bone structure, we all have the same bone structure underlying. So remember the giraffe and okapi we were talking about earlier? If you look at the bone structure of their necks, they all have 7 cervical vertebrae, so 7 bones in their neck. It's just that the giraffe has bigger and longer bones, but not a greater number of bones. So that is evidence, because they have the same number of bones in the same location, that they are related. How many do we have in our neck? 7. What about a dolphin's neck? You guessed it, 7. Another piece of evidence of evolution is vestigial organs, and those are organs that have no use in an organism but may not have disappeared because there's no disadvantage to having them. They're used to show common ancestry to another species in which the organ is still used. So for example, we don't have a tail, but we do have a tailbone. And dolphins do not have hind limbs, but they have vestigial pelvic bones. Cetaceans have no use for a pelvis and they have no legs, but the vestiges of a pelvis still remain. Analogous structures are body parts of 2 different species that have different structures but have the same function because those 2 species have adapted to a similar environment. This is not a suggestion of recent common ancestry. It's an example of convergent evolution, not divergent evolution. So a butterfly wing and a bird wing are very, very different in terms of their internal structure, but have the same function, and so they kind of look a little bit alike, on the outside anyway. Another piece of evidence of evolution is looking at embryonic similarities. So you can compare embryos of different species at different various stages of embryonic development to see who is most closely related. So the longer that the developing embryos of two species look alike, the more closely related the species are likely to be. So the species on the left is an elephant. The second from the left is a dog. Third from the left is a dolphin. And the far right is a human. And if we look at the human, the dog, and the elephant, they look a lot more alike than the dolphin. And it's just sort of an interesting thing that the further along in the development you go, the less alike they look. So if we're comparing embryos, early on, it's very hard to tell any difference. A little bit further, you can see more and more difference. The further along you go, the more differences you can see. Biochemical similarities are a more modern way of telling who's related to whom. All living things do contain certain similar biochemical compounds, and the closer relationship between the species, the greater their biochemical similarity. Sometimes we look at amino acid sequences. It's much easier to look at the protein sequence than it is to look at DNA sequence, or at least it used to be. We look at karyotypes. So those pictures that we showed you during the meiosis and genetics unit that showed you pictures of chromosomes can also be used because we look to see common chromosomes and banding pattern, and you can compare those karyotypes to see whose karyotypes look most alike. You can also sequence DNA and do DNA fingerprinting, so you can look for the banding pattern in a DNA fingerprint, but you can also actually sequence entire genes and entire genomes and use computers to compare them. One example that scientists have been using more recently are Hox genes, and these are master control genes that determine our general body plan. The idea that we have a head and a torso and an abdomen and different limbs. And those Hox genes are actually in the order of your body segments. And elements of the same body plan are shared throughout most of the animal kingdom. And the amount of Hox genes that are similar depend on how closely related those organisms are. And one experiment took a controller gene for eye development from a mouse and inserted it into a fruit fly chromosome at the location that codes for its knee joints. And that fruit fly had eyes on its knees. So another discussion we need to have is, how long does evolution take? So there are really two contrasting theories about the rate of evolution, and they are gradualism and punctuated equilibria. With gradualism, we have the idea that there are slow, gradual changes that accumulate in a species over time. The problem is there are a lot of gaps in the fossil record, and intermediate species that we would expect to be there have not been found. The other idea is that there are long, stable periods followed by short, rapid bursts in the rate of evolution, perhaps when the environment dramatically changes. And this would at least help to explain the gaps in the fossil record. Although, of course, it is possible that we not only have not found every fossil that there is, which is actually not just possible, but it's definite. But there, just because something dies in a location doesn't mean that all the right conditions will occur to create a fossil. So we're going to be missing fossils. We're going to be missing evidence and pieces of evidence. And the one thing that I always wondered as a student is, couldn't both of these be true? Couldn't sometimes there be slow, gradual changes and have that followed by short, rapid bursts in the rate of evolution? I don't see why not. So this shows some patterns and rates of evolution. So this sort of shows more of a rapid burst, the punctuated equilibrium idea versus gradualism. One of the things that you might be asked to do on a test is to interpret these diagrams. So, for example, you might suggest that these two species are more closely related to one another than this species and this species because they've branched more recently. So if you look at this bottom one, I would say these two species are the most closely related, and any species that stops before it getting to the top means that species has gone extinct. It's like a dead end. So these two species are still alive. This species still exists and this species still exists. This one became extinct a long time ago. This one became extinct much more recently. And it shows that they're all linked by a common ancestor if you go back far enough. So if you look at this, these two species are pretty closely related. These two species are related, but not as closely because that common ancestor is much further back.